sponsoring the pancake breakfast. Let's give them a big hand. These pancake breakfasts are so much fun. I was actually coming over to say to the crew here to come up on stage, and they were talking about a cartoon series, you know. So, you know, I like this crowd already. So, first of all, I just want to say the topic here, as you've seen on the slides, scaling with Service Mesh and Istio. As we well know, Service Mesh technologies are starting to, to be discussed a lot more, and there's reasons for that. But there's also a lot of, as we well know, there can be a lot of kind of thinking, well, what does this mean? What does this do? And there's so many implications to it. So, really look forward to the panel's perspective, but also your questions. And that's really the focus of our pancake breakfast, is to really focus on the questions that you have that you can ask the panelists here. So, everyone has a ticket, right? Does everyone have a ticket? Raise your hand if you don't have a ticket. There's one over here, there's one here. Anyone over here? There's one over here. Okay, so if you ask a question, you will be given 5 extra tickets. Okay? And the prize, Simon, would you like to show the prize? Arduino starter kit. And yesterday's winner is here, and he said, I went out and looked online to see what you could do, and he said there's so many search results, so now I'm just trying to figure out how Arduino kit can be used for a 4-year-old. I'm sure there is the use for Arduino kit with a 4-year-old. So in any case, look forward to getting this conversation started. What I would just like to do is introduce everyone. We have Simon. Simon, why don't you introduce yourself?
I call myself Simon.
Simon? Simon?
I'm an analyst with Gartner. I cover cloud-native infrastructure and modern networking.
Per?
CTO in the network and security business unit at VMware, and essentially covering from network virtualization to SD-WAN, app defense, and some of the evolution with Service Mesh on the products that we are doing. I like the word that Simon was saying about intelligent networking.
I'm Ken Owens. I'm at MasterCard, and I'm leading up a group of individuals that are really transforming the way MasterCard develops and manages cloud and a traditional infrastructure.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Lin, Product Management Director with the Google Cloud team. I've been focused a lot on what we've been doing in terms of our services platform and building out cloud-native technologies. Recently, spending a lot of time looking at sort of new models for hybrid scenarios, so excited to be here.
And I'm Jason McGee. I'm CTO for Cloud Platform at IBM, so I run all things Kubernetes, Service Mesh, serverless, cloud native at IBM.
So Per, I'd like to start with you, and perhaps you could give us, what your perspective is on, what Service Mesh means, and what does it mean to the customers who you're talking to? What are they asking about right now?
Yes, so maybe the journey towards the things that we're looking at Service Mesh started some time back. And when we did this transition from understanding networking as a bottom-up construct, as an infrastructure construct, to more about what can it do for the application? How, instead of pre-configuring the network ahead of deploying an application, how do I make that the network provisions itself with proper security once the application demands so? And this, when the methodologies of application development change towards CI/CD pipelines and automation and so on, then it becomes almost fundamental on how enterprises become efficient in the way they develop applications. So now, if we get to Service Mesh, I see it as the next natural evolution. As now applications move from the existing environments with more monolithic applications to microservices, now the question is, how do you have all these teams developing these different components of an application? How do they work together? How you secure, how you connect them, how you discover, how you scale them, how you make sure that you put the proper policies. How do you see what's going on in a way that you can automate and remediate the problems that you see? So Service Mesh, with this notion of giving identity to the services, understanding what the transactions between them are, and being able to put policy control and so on, it's the natural evolution in terms of how the infrastructure evolves or provides whatever the application needs. And if you see it like that, it's essentially as a continuum. It's how do you go from what we are trying to do with automation on traditional networks to how network virtualization kind of became the solution to do that. But now as we go deeper in the application is How do we solve that deeper in the application? And this is what Service Mesh solves.
So Jen, talking about that infrastructure itself, Istio came out of Google. Tell us about Istio and how it really came to be in Google.
Yeah, I think Perry summarized one of the major goals of Istio. Google's been using a similar technology for many, many years, and Google is obviously a team of software developers that write distributed systems in software. And the whole goal is to essentially make sure that developers can be very productive, and the concerns of platform governance and security and automation of the platform itself are built into the platform, so that application teams can essentially just check in code many times a day and not worry about the fact that they have different client libraries, or they have to write for a certain version of the kernel or whatever. So this abstraction at the service layer, I think, is the result of many years of what Google has been doing internally. We obviously launch about 4 billion containers a week in our production environment. We have done things like protobufs, where essentially we have structured data formats and real-time messaging. A lot of that allows us to address the issues of automation and security and things like intelligent routing, so development teams can check code in and not have to worry about the governance of the platform itself.
Did you say 4 billion a week?
4 billion a week.
And what's the rate of increase?
Well, just last year, I think we publicly said 2 billion a week. But yes, it's a very large-scale global system, and I think a lot of the model with site reliability engineers, which is our version of DevOps, they're really there to essentially support development teams being productive. So I think for many enterprises, in the IT organizations, a lot of the IT teams have felt that their job is essentially to make sure that they serve as human middleware as new things are checked into the environment. And I think what we're trying to do is basically put a lot of what is today manual processes into essentially the software system itself.
So Simon, if you do scale that out, kind of think about the numbers. We're talking about Google alone is more than 200 billion containers, 4 billion a week. But if you through the year, I mean, you're talking about a lot of containers. That means that there's probably hundreds of other billions of containers out there, without a doubt. So customers have to be thinking about this, or they have to be thinking about Service Mesh, or no?
Well, most of my customers don't start 2 billion customers a day. So
Yeah, but they may have. But if you think about the aggregate out there.
yes, well, there's an extreme amount of containers, but the problem now is when you start running, for example, Kubernetes and containers, you lack some visibility. So when my customers are interested these days, when I talk to operations, they're worried about the visibility of their services, and that's what it gives them. That's
visibility issue.
Yeah, it's a real visibility issue. So at first, my customer asked me, okay, what is Istio? What is Service Mesh? Now they're thinking of using it for visibility, and now they're starting to ask. And we have more than at least one a day inquiries by customer asking about stuff like, who should manage that? Sometimes the network people are worried, what I'm going to do about that? Or is it the application? Is it the network people? So that's the type of question I have.
Jason, I'm curious about your perspective on the technology itself. I've known you for many years through the discussing the evolution of the container landscape and how this world is evolving. How do you view Service Mesh? What is that kind of technology perspective that you bring and you think about?
Yeah, I think we've all been kind of on a journey together to build a new platform for apps. And with containers, with Kubernetes, with all the work we're doing in this community. And I think Service Mesh fills in a really important layer in that new architecture that we're building. I think many people are trying to get to microservice-based development. They want to have small teams that be able to be independent and own their life cycle. And you instantly get into, well, what about all the interactions between those teams? And what about the communication between them? And how do I roll out new things in a seamless way? And you quickly realize you need this kind of layer of not only visibility, but control over the collection of people that are working together in these new architectures. So for us, as we work together with Jennifer's team at Google, and brought Istio into the world, we were really looking at how do we give people that visibility and how do we give them that control so that they can be successful in adopting these new architectures that we've all been building together.
And the security as well.
Yeah, of course. You know, everyone wants to ignore security but can't ignore security.
Right.
So the question is, how do we make it as easy as possible for developers to build secure systems without having to be, you know, deep security experts?
Great. Well, now's the perfect time to think about a question you may want to ask. And we have Job Jackson, managing editor, my co-host here today. There's Job with the mic. We have a question? It's still manual. We have to, you know, turn.
Thank you. I would start with a question about the title, Service Mesh and Istio. What about the other service meshes? Why
Just Istio?
Yeah, why just Istio? Because we have Linkerd, which is a CNCF project. As far as I know, Lyft is not using Istio, but have its own control plane, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, Lyft obviously was a co-founder of the Istio project, and as a result of scaling the Envoy proxies in their production environment, you know, they learned and shared, I think, the learnings with the community and Google what some of those challenges are as they scale. So yes, you know, Envoy obviously is rocking it in terms of a universal data plane. Some of these questions or concerns that have come up in terms of, you know, as I scale that, how do I make sure that I have consistency and that I have security and that I have visibility so that essentially the people that are using essentially that data plane don't have to be concerned about it. So yes, there are many other service meshes. I think, you know, Istio has caught on like wildfire because essentially it was open source, and I think we collaborated with, you know, folks like IBM and Lyft that were seeing some of those same problems and brought actually quite diverse perspectives to what problem can we solve in a way that's vendor agnostic. So that's very important. I think, you know, there will be many service meshes, I think, that will thrive. I think what we tried to do is open source it under, you know, a permissive license early on so that essentially we could get the best thinking and scale for the industry. Within Google, I think, obviously, open source not only helps us check the assumptions that we're making, but make sure that we can, you know, grow a community early on and be sort of participatory. So I think that is, you know, service meshes in the last couple of years, I think, have been, you know, redefined a couple of times. But it is sort of the evolution at a higher layer of networking and security, and I think that's the intent of the...
Amazon even has one, apparently.
And maybe the other thing is, would be more interesting to see Ken explain about what kind of problems did he see and why he got interested in the technology, because as you said, there's many technologies that touch upon these topics. And what we were discussing even before the panel started is this notion that when we're going to have different systems with different technologies doing type of service meshes, right? At the end of the day is what's fundamental about this concept, and what do we do in order to carry information or metadata across the multiple technologies that are going to merge in a way that we have a universal concept that solves the specific problems that service mesh address. So maybe it would be good to understand from MasterCard, not about Istio or about Linkerd, but what was fundamental for MasterCard to start looking at these technologies.
Yeah, there's sort of two things at MasterCard, and I think this kind of rings true for just enterprises in general with your question. The first one is over the last, I don't know, 7, 8 years, there's been this move to kind of flatten the network. In the past, we had different network segments and zones, and we had a control plane and we had a data plane. And if something broke in the data plane, your control plane would allow you to get into the system and figure out what's wrong and fix it, right? As you flatten the network, that control plane went away, and everything was just in the data plane, and all of your control traffic was running in that data plane. And in that model, when the data plane goes down, you're screwed. You can't fix anything, right? Because what you're using to get to your devices is that data plane, and it's down. And so the first thing that we looked at a service mesh technology for was how do we segment the important signaling and the important transaction processing data that security and the networking team rely on to ensure that our services are always up and always available around the world. MasterCard, unlike other enterprises, we actually have a whole global network. We don't get to just worry about one region of the world, right? We have to worry about the entire world at the same time. And so we have to make sure that the network is always available, always up. And so that was the first problem we solved with service mesh, was ensuring that we have that visibility across the world at any given time, no matter what happens under the covers. And believe me, things break all the time that are physical and shouldn't break. They do break. To to Pierre's point, the second important thing with service mesh was as you automate your infrastructure and you start automating these services and your application team start adopting these practices, it's very easy to lose sight of what's happening between the application and the underlying dependent services that they're talking to. And most applications have reliability concerns with, databases or with, some type of a messaging queue or event processing buses. And so as you look at the complexity inside that, a lot of that gets abstracted as you containerize and create microservices. And so that the visibility you've heard a couple of times from the panel is really important to enterprises, because you have to understand what's the health of those underlying dependent services that in the past you didn't really have to worry about because they were segmented off on their own little separate environment that was always healthy, right? But now that as they're moving into the same model and all of these things are running in their own little isolated, scalable ways, the dependencies between them become very important, and the service mesh really helped us see that visibility into these underlying dependent services.
Simon, c'est bon.
I'd like to say something about the market. So there's about 10 vendors in the show floor that offers a service mesh, and none of it is GA yet. It's all beta, including yours. So that's interesting. And it's often a mix of what Istio does. Some of them augment the Istio control plane. Some interject in it like Helico. Some of them come from the ADC vendors like AVI or F5, which can use Envoy or their own, and sometimes their own ADC, managed by the Istio control planes. It's all a mix. Some of them, like Linkerd, are all on their own, but they were there before as well. So it's a very complex market at this point. But I think that Envoy might be like the intersection in most of them. You even have HashiCorp with Console Connect as a service mesh. So it's all over the place at this point.
And I see this as a good thing in the sense that if there was nobody looking at this space, it's probably because there's no interest. So the fact that there's many solutions to a problem means that at least there's enough interest from a consumption point of view, from an interest from customers' point of view, and at the same time enough interest from the creation side in a way that there's many ways to solve the problem. And now it's this notion of how do we figure out the way that intercepts best the compute platforms that we have, as well as how do we tie the present with the existing applications that we have in the data center, as well as with the SaaS elements. And I think we'll see a diversity of technologies still to flourish for a while until the whole thing settles into a more steady state environment.
And just to add to that one last thing that I just thought about with that last comment was, there's a lot of, from an enterprise standpoint, having a lot of options, a lot of choice is not always a good thing, right? And so right now we're at a point in the industry where there's a lot of abstraction, a lot of like service definition in the service interface, and we have to ensure that API has backwards compatibility, and there's a lot of complexity because of the fact that there are so many choices today. And so that's one opposite side to look at this, is that sometimes choice is not always the great thing.
Right. We have a question?
Yes.
Thank you and good morning. I think Istio has a great value proposition, but also it's another layer of complexity that we add to our system. What would be use cases or applications that would not benefit, or where you would say, don't put Istio in the game?
So what use cases should you should not be using it for?
I think for, let's say, existing environments where let's say many of our enterprise customers do want to start with the visibility, but some customers would say, I'm not changing my application environment and it's stable and I'm actually not going to be evolving that environment. That's probably not an area where they would invest in a service mesh. That being said, many of the customers want to get to a consistent model for thinking about services. So today it may be a monolithic database service that's been sitting there for 20 years. Tomorrow it may be a NoSQL database essentially, but the service health still needs to be monitored. So if you think about it as a service in terms of this is the SLO and the expectations in terms of serving that database to whatever applications or users need it, that model essentially abstracts how it's built. And then over time, just like Simone was saying, this whole business of getting a declarative config and setting a policy and then hiding the transitions that are happening underneath is essentially why I think this is catching on. Because traditionally, with the proprietary systems, all those configurations were tied to the physical device. And so you had to be triple certified in whatever that operating system was in order to configure that device. Now, with separation of the data and control plane, we can do it at a higher level and say the system needs to perform for the application this way, and under the covers, there may be multiple systems that essentially are evolving. And that's what frees the development teams and the operation teams. That decoupling is very important because that allows people to move at their own pace, but not break anything at the sort of managed service layer.
I think about it a little bit differently too. I mean, I think part of our job is to figure out how to manage and simplify that complexity. You know, if you look at the stack we're building, I mean, look at Kubernetes itself. If you get under the hood, Kubernetes is a complicated system. But I think with Service Mesh, as we integrate it into the platform, we can manage that complexity. One of the decisions we made in the project early on, which I think was a good one, was we built it on top of Kubernetes. We took the common API constructs and data constructs from Kubernetes, and we used them in Istio, so we weren't introducing yet another way to solve the same base problems that Kubernetes had already solved, and we could layer these new ideas on top. So I think we're going to get quickly to a point where service meshes and orchestrators, we don't think of them as two things. They're just two facets of the same thing put together.
You know, I really like your question because it makes me kind of think about my journey at MasterCard and how it's easy to start with sort of the newer platforms, right? So as you're bringing in something like a Kubernetes or you're bringing in some type of a transformational project, it's very easy to say, let's focus it on this technology with this capabilities, right? But when I look at the reason why we're thinking about service meshes, it's around security, it's around service visibility and health. And those things really benefit the entire enterprise and the entire services you're trying to deliver to your consumers. And a lot of what we've been doing on the automation front is bringing the Istio concept into our traditional legacy environment because we want that visibility, we want that security. There's no downside of having that type of capability in your traditional environment. And so we're not there yet, right? But we're starting to sort of bring that concept into database services and into messaging queues and things that are traditionally not in a Kubernetes or in a cloud native type of manner in any way. And it's been beneficial to do that. And so I can't think of anything right now other than the mainframe stuff that we're doing that we haven't thought about bringing it into yet. But in most cases, we're looking at it across the board.
And I also think that I changed my mind about that in the last few weeks, talking to customers. I used to think in order to gain any benefits from service mesh, you needed like dozens or hundreds of service and thousands of pods. It's not the case anymore. Even if you only have 10 service and 25 pods, you'll gain benefit just by the visibility itself and the abstraction layer. So just for the operational simplicity, it's worth.
Yeah, maybe it's a little less, do I use something like Istio or not, and more about how do I use it. I mean, Istio does visibility, it does security, it does control. I think it's which capability do I adopt when and for what problem, right? I think for most people, there's some value there for a portion of what service meshes do.
Great question.
Hi, I'm really interested in hearing about the transition to service mesh. We've invested quite a lot in like centrally managed like service discovery, centrally managed identity management, and it's hard to make the. I could see the benefit of we miss out on logging some traffic or if something happens with that central server, but that rollout is something that we just have trouble wrapping our heads around, like how do you roll that out? Does a sidecar have to know to communicate to, like do we have to build something in to communicate to those central servers and stuff?
Yeah, I think like Jason was saying, we just recently, at least for the GKE environment, talked about Istio on GKE and making that super easy. Kube control apply Istio. I think, as Jason was saying, a lot of the benefits of Kubernetes is essentially abstracting a lot of the complexities of just the base infrastructure, and that's why Kubernetes is sort of a natural starting point, even though Istio wasn't really tied to Kubernetes as an orchestration layer. I think if it's transparent, then I think we're doing our job well. In terms of inserting it, it should be just part of an extension of your existing infrastructure environment so that you can rapidly make changes, but essentially you have a common abstraction that doesn't change. And, I think it's early days, as Simone says, but The challenge before was essentially upgrading for each bespoke area of your environment. And hopefully this is a consistent way, whether it's within a certain cloud or on-prem or in many other clouds. I think the reason why it's gaining a lot of traction is by nature, it's a framework and an implementation. And the implementation for each vendor can be pluggable into the same framework. And I think because it is by nature a communication technology, it doesn't, we hope over time that people contribute to it so that networking grew in the IP layer because essentially one vendor's router could talk to another vendor's router. So, if you design a communication system and essentially you don't have sort of the whole community behind it, it obviously dilutes a little bit of the value. Quickly, I think we've gotten a number of the major players to say, yeah, let's not spend the next, decade figuring out different versions of it. Let's get behind one and essentially make sure that we can change the industry together.
Maybe a different spin on your question about insertion, right? At least to the customers that we are talking to, we see two types of questions. The first one is, I have my cloud-native application. How do I insert a service mesh layer in a transparent manner? And what Jennifer was describing is correct, is what are the mechanisms in a way that now I can do like a sidecar injection on existing services, rolling them up into this new technology, and configuring the routes in a way that the service that lives in this cloud-native space doesn't break. But there is a more subtle question, as what you were saying about the discovery of services and the connectivity to those, which is, what about all the services that right now are not in the mesh? Now, as I roll up this type of service mesh technologies, we made it easy in order to put the sidecar proxies, to configure the traffic routes, to put the policies. But now the question is, how do we tie it to some of the discovery systems that you have already that understand what type of configurations you have into traditional ADC solutions, what type of configurations you have on OpenStack environments, on vCenter environments, and so on, in a way that now we expose through the mechanism of understanding how the DNS in one side and the load balancing in one side connects to the other, in a way that we don't make this thing a bubble, a greenfield bubble into this new wall, but rather how do we have a continuum with existing systems that have not yet deployed this type of technologies. So from our side, we've been putting quite a bit of effort on that, and we are still in the beginning of the journey, as Simon was pointing out. But the insertion is not only how to insert the service mesh, but how to make this service mesh talk to the existing infrastructure that you have.
All right, question.
So along the line of getting all the players working together, has there been an interest in standardizing the interface between the control plane and the data plane so that we can evolve those two planes kind of independently and be focused just on what they need?
That's called APIs, right? In the sense that the notion of standards has changed a lot, and maybe coming a bit more from a networking background as some of us, we went through this phase that essentially bodies like ITF and IEEE and everything would standardize protocols, would standardize interfaces. And then you would create a draft, and then people would follow that and would create interoperability tests. When you go in towards communities and open source, the standard is almost like the APIs and the abstractions that the code has itself. Now the question is, there's a subtle question about what's the standard. Is it the API or is it the code itself? Because sometimes in open source it's difficult to decouple the implementation from the abstraction. And that created some problem in some other open source projects, right? But the notion that the fact that the API is open, it's almost like a moving standard, which it forces everybody around that standard to constantly have to test and evolve with that code. But by the fact that it's open is a form of standardization.
Yeah, I think that's a super important evolution for the industry. I mean, for those of us that have been to IETF and Interop, and I mean, that process took a long time and it was very thorough, but getting a draft into a ratified standard was quite many years, right? Now I think you're taking a lot of the folks that have participated in that model of standardization for communications technology. Now that we have sort of it out in the open and transparent, you can get eyeballs on it and essentially evolve it much, much quicker. And if it's not the thing that wins out, people move on to the next thing pretty quickly.
What's the status of the governance for Istio right now?
Yeah, I think we've put essentially the governance out there, and we're contributing with Lyft and IBM. All the minutes are out there. We've been very public about sort of the direction of the project. We hit 1.0 in July, so it's still actually a relatively early project. But we quickly put the code out there under the Apache V2 license. We already obviously have a governance model in place where a lot of the contributions obviously started from Google, but we're picking up obviously more and more of the community. And because IBM was also about to open source a similar project, I think we hit the ground running with making sure that we were addressing not only the sort of HTTPS challenges that we were familiar on with containers and microservices, but also how do we do this in a way that there's investment protection for those that essentially want to use it as the new network layer.
Just a quick follow-up question. Istio, though, is managed by Google, correct?
It is a Google-managed project today, yes.
Right. And Kubernetes is a CNCF project.
Correct. And when Google donated Kubernetes to the CNCF, it was actually quite a mature project at the time that it was donated. So yes, we love what's going on with Kubernetes, but I will say Kubernetes is quite a bit more mature than Istio.
So is Istio going in that direction too?
Yes.
Will it be part of the foundation at some point?
We are definitely learning a lot from the evolution of something like the Kubernetes community, but we want to make sure that we're inclusive to other communities because we believe Istio is, Kubernetes is moving very quickly, and I think it's changing the world of containers pretty quickly, but it is still a minority subset of the workloads that are out there.
So in the meantime, it'll be managed internally. At some point, you may consider donating it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we've already donated, under the most permissive license possible. So I think the sort of participation in the community, all the benefits that we're talking about in terms of getting essentially everybody looking at it and critiquing it, I think we're getting a lot of that.
Yeah, and we already have an open governance model around it, and we're very transparent about how we run it. So it has the right, and frankly, CNCF itself doesn't dictate a process. So we already have the process around how we run the project, right? And bringing it into CNCF when that's the next step that we do won't really actually change the way the governance of the project runs, right?
Okay.
So we've already set it up in that way.
Great question.
Yeah, hi. You already almost answered my question, but are you involved in Istio development, and at what level? And what are the next key features that will be added in Istio?
So I can take a start at that. So yes, at least three of us on the panel are actively contributing to the project. Istio is an interesting thing. I was thinking actually, our teams, the Google and IBM teams, got together and kind of started to kick off Istio 2 years ago at this event down the street at the Sheraton, where we had our original discussions. And service meshes seemed like a new thing, but actually, I think when we got together, we had both been doing work in that space for at least a couple of years before we even started. So we're, from a code-based perspective, 4 years into this journey, at least. And I think with Istio, from my perspective, the most important thing next is adoption, right? Driving adoption. We spent a lot of time this summer getting to 1.0. I think Istio has an incredibly rich feature set for a 1.0 project, and it has an incredibly solid foundation. The building blocks that we brought together are all proven things. So I think I'm actually more interested in adoption and seeing what we learn from people running it than some long list of additional features that we have to go build in the project.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the roadmap has been put out there, but like Jason said, I think right around the 1.0 time frame, the team took a step back to make sure that essentially some of the usability and scaling aspects were addressed. Because up until 1.0, it had been incredible feature velocity. And I think, moving forward, one of the things that I think is changing in the environments that we're going into are the expectations around security. So for enterprises, I think it used to be okay to just put a hard shell around the enterprise and essentially call that your security layer. Then folks sort of moved into microsegmentation because they wanted isolation, at the host level. And I think what we're trying to do is get sort of tenant isolation and service isolation combined so that when we authenticate a service, you're not reinventing, that whole sort of thing again, and we hide the complexity on how do we issue the credentials and how do we tie that into user identity and how do we make sure that we move to this zero trust model where as users are sort of accessing from anywhere and the sort of granularity of microservices is not just within a cluster with a VLAN wrapped around it. I think those models of how do we get more granular and how do we support more dynamic access layers is super interesting, and I think the whole community is interested in seeing that as a major part of the evolution of the project. initially, as Simone said, there was incredible interest in just providing better visibility. So a lot of enterprises have bespoke, probably 50 different monitoring tools, and they try and ingest that into some batch process job so they can understand all the data. So the first thing has been around how do we ingest a lot of data, provide better telemetry, at a much more granular level, but turn it into a metric of service health. So you're not just collecting a bunch of data. There's actually insight when you collect that data because you've defined the service up front. So I think there's lots of things to do, but I think there's been, pretty good alignment on kind of where folks want to see the project go.
Great. Let's get to another question.
Can you talk about main focused areas for improvement next, like latency, performance, et cetera? And also, from operation point of view, what are the cost considerations?
Yeah. Maybe on the areas of improvement. I mean, one, of course, the one that has been already mentioned in terms of how to make it more usable, more operational ready, more scalable, more stable, right? That's the notion of getting towards usability. The other place where we are seeing some expansion and we are contributing to some of those areas is how do we start getting more visibility at the protocol level? Right now, there's a lot of effort going in HTTP, in gRPC, in Kafka, and so on. But as we get in towards a mesh that can federate not only between service to service, but try to understand what services are doing against what data objects, what authenticated users are doing to a service, and how that service talks to another service on behalf of that user. So I think the next area is how to stitch the flow of the service mesh on not just seeing and understanding service-to-service communications, but understanding what matters to the enterprises, which is be able to see one level up. What's the user experience? I mean, the service may have a 99% latency that is increasing, but what's the effect in terms of how a user experience a chain of service or a service graph? Then you say, this user happens to be in Europe. What is he doing writing data into a US-based database? How do I get visibility into that? So I think the two dimensions where we are trying to extend the capabilities of Istio and Envoy is one, to make it production-ready, adoption, and easy to operate, easy to configure, easy to manage, and so on, and easy to scale. The other is how do we stitch the workflow of what matters to enterprises? And this is going beyond the service-to-service communication and adding more capabilities. Now, to do that, it may not require like major changes into the current existing environment because maybe it's adding more with the WebAssembly, more capabilities at layer 7, the ability to carry the tokens and so on. So it's these two dimensions that we see, but definitely stitching things beyond the microservices is one of the areas that needs a little bit of energy.
The other area which I think there's a lot of work going on is how do we federate mesh environments across existing data centers, public clouds. Part of what a lot of people are struggling with is their IT landscape's very diverse and you're using all kinds of different environments. And one of the things I think was a real advantage around the service mesh approach is because we're dealing with things higher up in the stack, closer to the application. We can do segmentation and security and visibility and routing across a very diverse network landscape and a very diverse environment. And I think the project has work to do, which we've already started, but work to do to make it easy to kind of connect these different mesh environments together and flow control and metadata across those environments.
Question.
Security, specifically in a multi-tenant environment, is hard. Can you speak to kind of what guarantees Istio brings to the table for developers, and then what responsibilities developers have to be sure that we're being good Istio service mesh citizens?
So we are actually drafting a white paper because I think this is a question that often comes up. But one of the key pain points that we hear from developers is they know they need to write their application to be secure, but it's a big drag for them in terms of productivity to have to put OAuth tokens into the source code, and then essentially to have to manage for each bespoke application environment. What do I do with all of these bespoke models for managing tokens and credentials and secrets and all of this? I think what Istio is trying to do is basically make that whole thing transparent and move it out of the developer's pain point. Because what the developer wants to do is not worry about what IP address and what port and how does this application tie to the physical infrastructure, but more just what application, what user experience am I trying to drive. So this is actually coming from a pain point that we hear a lot, which is the developers like flexibility in their development environment. They want to be in a sort of continuous delivery environment. They know they need to address security, and so they end up doing it in the source code, and that actually creates more of an operational problem. So if it's just part of the platform itself, and when you check your code in, it essentially, the service is created and essentially the security model is established as part of the platform, I think it's a big productivity gain.
Simone, do you see your customers that have the teams to be able to, to use service mesh technologies? I mean, what is the level of education out there?
Well, I think now there's a learning curve, but we talk about this new team, which we call platform ops, which manage a platform. They're the team that used to manage paths, but now they would manage Kubernetes, but even maybe a CI/CD like pipeline, the toolkit. And we see that team as owning the service mesh. And this is a team that has both people from the infrastructure, maybe some network people used to manage the EDC, but also people from the application side. So it's in between infrastructure and application. Mm-hmm. And it's basically where the DevOps really is, kind of the core of DevOps. Mm-hmm. But we see that type of team that will have to manage the service mesh.
And just to add to the security piece, right? The security has multiple layers in everything you do, right? And so what we're doing with the service mesh is basically taking out by default, services cannot talk to each other, right? You're not allowed to communicate to any other services as you write and push your code out, right? Only the system that is of the control of what's going on can allow your service to talk to another service based on the policies we define for what you've deployed and what country you're in and what the application customer is trying to do with that data, right? And so we've wrapped an entire policy decision system around everything we deploy so that as the developer pushes their code out, they've written their code securely, right? We've done through the pipeline, we do the security, the static code analysis, we do vulnerability analysis, we do chaos testing, right? So we do all of that as part of your deployment. So your code is secure, but we're not going to let you talk to anything until we know you're allowed to talk to something, and we don't let you make that decision because you don't know, right? You don't know who this customer is, you don't know where they're coming from, you don't know what other system things are happening at that time. The platform does, and so the platform handles what is allowed to talk to what, and it makes the developer's job much simpler because you don't have to worry about who am I talking to at this moment, what's their identity, because you don't know it. Your code doesn't know it, but the platform knows their identity and knows what they're doing.
You can think of it as a service mesh as establishing like dynamic zero trust network between the services. So you have more security than you never had in
Great.
theory.
We don't have much more time, so I'd like to get another question in, and maybe Per can help us answer.
Hi. I was just wondering if the Istio project was solely focused on HTTP, HTTP2, gRPC layer, or other connections are going to be supported eventually?
Yeah, so it started as HTTPS, and in the .4 release, I believe we supported TCPIP. So yes, it started essentially for more of a cloud-native environment over layer 7. But I think this whole notion of how do we make sure that there are, let's say, we can pull existing policies through the adapter model and address essentially things at the IP layer, because today a lot of folks are putting, let's say, proprietary firewalls in place and setting ACLs on that at a demarc that is, let's say, exiting the cluster or exiting essentially the gateway on-prem. And over time, as this model gets more granular, we can take different policies from different environments and make sure either at the network layer or at the layer 7 application layer, we're addressing those policies.
I would also add, I think the other space that we don't have yet, but I think we need is async model for Istio. So I'm using messaging or Kafka or something like that. That's another completely valid style of interaction that all of the concepts that we're trying to do in service mesh still apply, but the implementation needs to be different. So that's an area where there's work to be done.
Per, any thoughts?
Yeah, the same. And then, of course, there's a lot of use cases around IoT, a lot of push on UDP support for Istio and Envoy. So no, I don't think it's specific to HTTP or gRPC. It's just that it was easier to start with those protocols because the utilization cloud native, but we have to take it and we will take it to other spaces.
We have a question?
Hi. We're actually going to be rolling out on Istio 1.0 hopefully in the next month. And I'm getting a lot of pushback from developers, one around they don't like the fact their health check has to be on a different port, which I guess is kind of a minor inconvenience, but not if you have 60 microservices. And the other is wrapping their heads around this whole idea of outgoing calls being HTTP, even to external endpoints. And is that something you think that's typical? Am I explaining things wrong? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's maybe related to the other discussion. I think we can do a better job, and I think the Istio website, I think, has recently been refreshed to try and make it easier both for the developer community as well as the user community to understand why these things are important and what some of the paradigms and best practices are. But stay tuned on that. I think it's good to hear that feedback because things like the FAQs and best practices and all of that, and sort of what priorities should developers be thinking about as they use this architecture are the types of things we want to produce more to help the community.
I would also add maybe a little bit back to your question, like how to be a good citizen using Istio. I mean, I think once you get your head wrapped around service mesh, what you're really saying is certain functions are being delegated down to the mesh. And so as a developer, I don't do those anymore in my code, whether it's OAuth tokens for security or some of the communication things. I can do straight HTTP and let the mesh take over and let mesh policy decide whether I convert that to HTTPS and what token or what certificates I use and the like. So you have to start to think about things a little bit differently because the mesh is taking over some work that you would have done yourself before.
Any last thoughts? Simon? Anything?
I'm also interested in service mesh across clouds, going back to the data center as, over a flat network, service talking to each other across a flat network. That's very interesting for me.
Great.
For me, the comment would be going back to what Jennifer was saying, that now it has to be about adoption and trying to understand the type of concerns that developers may have as some responsibility shifts away, or as Simon was putting the federation aspect on how to adjust federation to the existing environments of private IP addresses and firewalls, and focus on the stability and scalability. So essentially, we have to stop talking about new and fancier capabilities and see what are the impediments that you guys are experiencing in the industry to make this a reality. And rather than focusing on more features, this is practical problems and how do we make this deployable.
Excellent. Well, this has been a great discussion. Let's thank the panel very much for their answers. And now it's time for the drawing, but first, let's give another big hand for VMware for making this breakfast possible. And we know Jason has to get over to the keynote, so we're going to let him go. But let's have a drawing. Did everyone get a ticket when they walked in the door? All right. All right. The anticipation is building. And I just want to say, we once had a pancake robot that we'd bring to the breakfast, but we decided that sifting flour at 4 in the morning wasn't really our thing. So we donated the pancake robot to Ken, and his kids have been working on it. So someday, perhaps the robot will be back with your kids, right? All right. Okay, so let's have a drawing.
Oh, wow. Boy, don't blame me. You get to read it. All right. The lucky number is 574175. Is that mine?
All right, we got a winner.
All right.
Woo.
Congratulations.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your attendance. And I want to thank the team at the News Stack for helping us make these pancake breakfasts possible. Thanks. Thank you. Have a great day.